Shallaballah. A wig covered his bald scalp. His face was a patchwork of skin joined together by ugly black stitches. Mr. Punch told him that, given time, the resulting scars would be scarcely noticeable. Eventually, they would almost fade away and leave him only thin lines that could not be seen except under an extremely bright light. But as Sogol examined his own features in the mirror, tracing his fingers over the threads that held the flesh together, he found it difficult to believe that what he saw would ever again resemble his old familiar face. His reflection was like a mask, dead and expressionless. Sogol tried to remember that Mr. Punch had told him this was to be expected, and that nerve-to-muscle control would take a few days to return. Yet he had not really been prepared for the reality of just how ghastly he would appear in the interim. He poked a fingernail into the skin, but felt nothing. It was like touching another person. A gigantic industrial estate with narrow walkways, corridors, and alleys. The squat square buildings are made of concrete. They are run down and dismal. Many of the windows are broken. On the flat roofs, there are crooked TV aerials and grimy satellite dishes. They look like bizarre scarecrows and are framed against an orange-colored sky. Subsidence and age have made the structures lean together. Flights of twisted stairs link one level to another. Sogol sat on the edge of the camp bed. Its mattress was soiled and hollowed in the center, a reminder of all those who had been here before him. Mr. Punch's clinic offered the most meager hospitality, despite the exorbitant cost of his special type of treatment. Those who went under his knife did so in the knowledge that the gentleman was a criminal, possibly even insane, but still his patients came. There was nowhere else for them to go. This horrible little building, with its dusty windows and peeling paintwork, hidden away in a run-down ghetto estate, was a recondite Lourdes, where one offered up hard cash in exchange for miracles. He'd heard rumors about the celebrities who had passed through here, film actresses who, beyond the help of lighting and makeup, even of facelifts or plastic surgery, had extended their shelf life by more than a decade by utilizing the services of Mr. Punch. One did not approach him. There was no way to contact him. Mr. Punch would call on the telephone, offering his services to those he knew were most in need. Celebrities, of course. Only ever celebrities who could afford the fees he charged. And then his black ambulance would call in secret at an appointed time. In Sogol's case, it was after the car accident. The TV company had paid a lot of money to hush the thing up. This was, after all, right in the middle of filming the episode that was going to be next year's ratings triumph. Only Mr. Punch could repair the damage that Sogol had suffered in the crash. Only Mr. Punch could reconstruct his monstrously burned face in time. Sogol, coked up to the eyeballs, driving a sports car, a bottle of scotch with just a dribble left in it lying beside him on the passenger seat, and a hairpin bend on the hillside road, leaving behind some woman who meant nothing to him, 3 days ago. Strange to think it had only been less than a week. The interiors of the dismal buildings are not homes. They contain no dwellings. Inside, one would find a series of strange rooms, cluttered with all manner of what appears to be junk. Pot plants, framed pictures, coat stands, mounds of clothes, and painted backdrops. "You cannot leave," Mr. Punch had told him in a letter passed to Sogol, "until your treatment is complete. You must follow my instructions in each and every detail. If you fail to do so, I cannot be held responsible for what might happen to your face." Sogol had groaned at this statement and crumpled the letter in his hands. He was desperate to leave this anonymous ghetto in a town whose name he could not even recall. God knows in the past he had spent time in enough sleazy hotels in pursuit of fame, playing bit parts where he might be called to the set at any moment in order to wander in front of the cameras and utter a line or two of dialogue. But that was before he had struck it big, before his face was known to everyone he met, before he'd graced the cover of gossip magazines, before interviews with him were sought by all the TV chat show hosts. But if he left now, people would turn their heads in horror, not in awed recognition as he passed them by. A man with a cracked face, a freak, a refugee from a sideshow who happened to bear a passing resemblance to a famous TV soap opera star. Sogol, winner of 3 prestigious awards for Best Leading Male Role, one of the most highly paid actors on television, a man whom the public adored, a man who was witty, charming, and handsome. Handsome above all, but now reduced to this intolerable, pitiful state of existence. There are dusty corridors within the structures of the immense industrial estate. Faded TV schedules are pinned to the walls. The same programs are broadcast at the same time, day after day, night after night. The same films, the same episodes of soap operas, the same documentaries, the same panel games and quiz shows. In the photos accompanying the text, all the celebrities wear fixed smiles. Their eyes are open too wide, as if they regard the camera with fear. Sogol made his way along the passageway outside his room. At the end was the pay phone that he was permitted to use. Mr. Punch had banned mobile phones from his clinic. He confiscated them from patients as soon as they were admitted. "No distractions," Mr. Punch had explained. "No stress-inducing conversations. Complete rest. If you must make an urgent call, then there is a telephone available. Calls are monitored, however, for your own benefit. Unnecessary exploitation of this service will result in the connection being terminated and the privilege withdrawn." Up in the corner of the middle of the passageway, in the angle between the far wall and the ceiling, was a surveillance camera. It moved through an arc on its wall-mount base in order to keep Sogol in its line of sight as he passed by. He cradled the receiver between his ear and shoulder and dialed the number with his right hand as he scanned the little black phone book in his left. Just then he felt the beginnings of a dull pain well up around his forehead and along his jawline, a sure sign that the nurse would soon be making her rounds with the drug trolley. Strange that he was now marking time by the effects of painkillers wearing off. "Catch entertainments," the sound of a bored, unfamiliar female voice came down the line. Catch what? Had Sogol heard her right? "Put me through to Joey," he said through stiffened lips. "Tell him it's Sogol." There was a pause, and some tinny music played as his call was transferred. After a few seconds, Jackson spoke. "Hi, Joey, it's me." "Sogol, where the bloody hell are you? What was his problem?"
"What do you think I am, you idiot? Still in the clinic, of course."
"What clinic?" Why haven't you phoned in? I've gone half crazy sorting out the seaside shows and have to be canceled. You've lost us a lot of money. If you think you're still represented by this agency, think again. Had Joey lost his mind? What was this, his idea of a joke? I'm having my face reconstructed here, and you're acting like an asshole, Sobel hissed through his teeth. But in mid-sentence the line went dead. There was a loud click, and then a droning, recorded voice said, "This call is terminated. Please return to your room at once." Sobel replaced the receiver and then tried to dial again. However, before he'd even completed entering the whole telephone number, he heard the same recorded instruction. "This call is terminated. Please return to your room at once." Sobel looked back over his shoulder. The surveillance camera was trained on him. Right now, someone was doubtless watching him on one of the pictures from a bank of CCTV screens, watching and waiting to see whether he would comply. I'm not being treated like some nobody, Sobel thought. I'm not standing for this anymore. I'm Sobel. I'm not in prison. Just then a set of double doors at the end of the corridor opened, and two huge men clad in three-quarter-length black coats and bowler hats strode purposefully toward him. They looked like undertakers rather than orderlies. Nevertheless, rather than displaying any sign of his being intimidated, Sobel advanced to meet the pair. But within moments, despite his screams of protest, his arms were pinned behind his back, and he was frog-marched back along the corridor and thrown into his room. They locked the door behind him once they left. Neither of them had uttered a word to him, but had been cold and silent, going about their business of restraint and coercion in a mechanical, indifferent fashion. Had the situation required it, Sobel was sure that they would not have balked at actually beating him into submission. Within the structures, with the twisted TV aerials on the roofs, one can hear sounds. They echo along the corridors coated with peeling paintwork. There is laughter without any humor in it, shrill, cold laughter, and it is accompanied by a series of groans. The groans seem to come from weakened lungs and throats. When the groans falter, there is a horrible tittering, like that of a demented child, and then they begin all over again. This goes on for hours and hours. Finally, the sounds are suddenly replaced by the dim hiss of static. This lasts for a few seconds, and then the whole process repeats itself without cessation. Sobel was perched on the edge of the camp bed, waiting for someone to come and attend to him. He'd pushed the summons button over and over again, but the nurse had not responded. Was he being punished for his actions? He knew that it was long past the time he was due his medication. The flesh beneath the skin of his face itched unbearably, as if it was infested with spectral bugs, and despite the consequences, Sobel could not stop scratching. He felt nothing. The outer layers of his facial skin were as numb as before, but at least it brought some temporary relief further down. Perhaps the bugs stopped crawling when they were sure that he was still alive. He'd taken off the wig and sat there staring at the shoddy thing as he turned it over repeatedly in his hands. It was made of rough, artificial fibers, and the brown fake hair was held together by a mesh that rested next to the scalp when worn. Mr. Punch had advised him that Sobel's own hair would begin to grow back within days, but there was no sign of bristle on his skull, simply the same bald, mottled patchwork he discovered when he'd awoken after the operation. Up in the corner of the room was a fixture that he couldn't remember having seen previously. It was a dusty old light fitting with a bulb screwed into the socket. Underneath was a small rectangular panel that was covered in a thick layer of dust. Sokol got up to examine it more closely. He scraped away the debris to reveal the words "On Air" etched into its glass front. The bulb above the lettering was colored a deep red. Perhaps Mr. Punch had put it there as a tribute to his patients, in recognition of their celebrity status. It was a weird thing to do, since in every other detail he had made no similar gestures. How could he possibly consider this seedy flea pit as suitable for the glitterati? What matter that such an absurd concession had been made when compared to the grubby cells and corridors, the lack of proper heating and basic facilities? Outside in the corridor he could hear the sound of the nurse finally making her rounds with the drugs trolley. It rattled like a jar of nails as she slowly wheeled the thing along the uneven linoleum. Sokol banged ferociously on the door in an attempt to attract her attention. He began shouting at the top of his voice, and he demanded she see to him first and that he was suffering terrible pain. "I'm next, you old bitch! I'm next! I'm dying in here!" A grill in the door opened, and through the latticework her thin, doll-like head hoved into view. The nurse wore an old-fashioned mob cap. She looked at him with small black eyes devoid of emotion. "Stage fright, eh? Stage fright?" The words came from a toothless hole ringed by a gaudy mess of smeared lipstick. Saliva oozed down out of it onto a flabby chin dotted with hairs. "Open wide, Ugly! Open wide for Nurse Judy!" She thrust 2 green-coated pills through the interstices and dropped them. Sokol scrambled to the floor and then swallowed them eagerly. When he looked up, the grill was closed again, and he heard her continuing her rounds, whistling a discordant melody. After 15 minutes had passed, the 2 grim-faced orderlies entered his room, picked Sokol up from the floor, and slung him onto the bed, strapping him down to it. They left the door open, on purpose it seemed, and he stared at the aperture with dry, unblinking eyes. There were moments when the uninterrupted light affecting his retina turned everything into a hazy fog of white blindness. There is an old television set, dating from the 1930s or 1940s. It is housed in a 4-foot-tall wooden cabinet with a 10-inch high flickering blue screen on the front. In a darkened, derelict room, a shadowy figure with a patchwork face silently watches the display. The signal that the device is receiving is an image of a long out-of-date test card. In the center of the image is a circle with vertical lines that thicken from right to left. Outside the circle is a black space that fills the rest of the screen. Written in white lettering on the space are the following words. Above the circle are a logo and a slogan. Shallaballah, television, is the new afterlife. Right, delayed images, ghosts may appear on the black or white strips. Left, reception reports may be sent to Mr. Punch, College of Professors, English Division, London, N19. Underneath, test transmission. Accompanying the visual broadcast is a monaural sound, a 4-frequency tone that ranges from a very low droning whine to a very high shrill pitch. It is played on a continuous loop. The individual watching and listening to the broadcast is humming to himself, and he eerily mimics the noise coming from the television set speaker, as if hypnotized. Sogol heard footsteps and murmuring voices from outside in the corridor. It sounded like someone was conversing with the nurse, and he was certain that he heard his name mentioned, though exactly what they were discussing was too indistinguishable to make out. When she came into the room, she was carrying an old suitcase, which she set down on the end of his bed. The nurse opened it and took out items of stage makeup, foundation, powder, and natural skin colorings, as well as a small set of scissors and tweezers. She began to cut and unpick his stitches from his skin. Once she'd finished, she applied some of the makeup to his face, doing her best to mask his blemishes and wounds. A TV studio with a set designed to look like an operating theater from the 1930s or 1940s. The cameras that the operators are using are as out of date as the mock surroundings. Each device requires not only someone to point the lens, but also someone else to wheel it around at the base as it closes in on a shot. At the operating table are life-size Punch and Judy puppets in white smocks, masks, and gloves. Their movements are stiff and awkward, although Punch tries occasionally to caper. Judy passes surgical implements over to him as he tinkers with the exposed brain of a man whose skull has been sawn open. Punch makes incisions in the man's frontal lobe with a scalpel and inserts a series of wires into the holes. The wires are connected to an obsolete television set next to the operating table. The TV is switched on. During the operation, a camera draws closer, and on the screen next to the table, the heavily made-up face of the man being operated on can be seen quite clearly. Though the image is grainy and slightly distorted, his eyes are open. They move from side to side. Not once does he blink. During the operation, Punch and Judy quarrel with each other. Punch throws Judy to the floor and changes the channel on the TV set, moving a frequency dial until it's tuned into a station showing a program in which the patient on the table is the star. Sogol wandered along the corridors beyond his own room. The effects of the drug had worn off some hours before, although he still suffered from stiffness in his legs and back, making him walk with a shuffling gait like that of an elderly man. It seemed that his treatment was over, for a note left in his room had advised him that he was to be released after a final interview and examination by Mr. Punch. He ran his fingers over the flesh of his face. It was almost totally smooth, except for some very thin scar lines, and all the lost sensation and movement had now returned. As the CCTV cameras tracked Sogol's movement through the passageways, he could not resist turning his gaze upon them, so that whoever was observing him could not help but see him more clearly. Once, he even flashed one of his best trademark smiles at the indifferent lens. The only thing that continued to trouble him was the damned wig, but he had to wear it in order to cover the fresh stitches that had been sewn all the way around his head. Anyway, as soon as he was on the outside, it would be easy enough to find a more sophisticated and comfortable hairpiece. He passed through a set of double doors. Above the entrance, Sogol saw a green sign that read, Studio 7. He gazed around him with bemused astonishment at what he saw in the room. It was dusty and almost bare. At the far end stood a portable canvas booth, like those used for puppet theater. However, where the stage opening should be, there was instead a television screen. The device inside was switched on, but the picture showed only a card with the words, "An announcement is being made in sound," on a black background. The sound it emitted was a 4-frequency tone, its pitch rising and falling. In the center of the room, a hangman's noose dangled from the ceiling. Directly beneath it was a trapdoor, operated by a lever mechanism fixed onto the bare floorboards. Then Punch and Judy appeared from behind him. They seized Sogol, and although he struggled wildly, the two of them quickly had his hands bound behind his back with a length of cord. Mr. Punch placed a noose over his neck and tightened the knot until the rope chafed his throat. Judy dragged his body by its legs into a standing position above the trapdoor. Neither of them spoke a word, maintaining a grim, terrifying silence. Mr. Punch beat Sogol about his head viciously with a stick until he stopped resisting. When Sogol was in the right position, the test card on the screen faded out, although the 4-frequency tone continued to be broadcast. The inky blackness slowly gave way to black and white static. Inside the chaos of the electronic snow, features began to coalesce and take shape. A deformed maw that might have been a mouth, and twin holes that might have been empty eye sockets. Mr. Punch covered Sogol's head with a cloth bag. For some reason it had mouth and eye holes cut into the rough material. Then the lever was pulled, and Sogol's flailing body dropped into the opening that appeared beneath him. He fell for 15 feet before the rope reached its full length, and the knot at the base of his skull snapped his neck. Up in Studio 7, the face on the television screen in the booth continued to take shape. Its features became more distinct and more like those of Sogol with each moment that passed.